Alright guys, so the AquaTerrarium, the Paludarium, the Vivarium, whatever you want to call this thing, it's finally done. I've been sitting on this tank for probably 4, maybe even 5 months. You saw the kind of cinematic setup of it, but let's give it kind of like a proper rundown here, just in case you're a little bit more curious about what we did. The tank itself is a Waterbox Terra, and I'm not sure if these are going to stick around on Waterbox's website for very much longer. I know that they're going to be doing a sale here on them, so we'll have links and maybe some more information about that down in the description. But this thing is 24 across, it's 18 front to back, and then this portion down here where the water level sits is about 6 inches from top to bottom. I think it holds right around 10 gallons, maybe a little bit less, and certainly less now that we have all of this stuff in here. And the reason for why I didn't narrate while I was setting it up like I typically do is because I didn't know what I was doing. So I think now that I have a little bit more perspective, this is a good time to do it. Anyway, the rock that we use in here, black lava stone, this is stuff that I've collected over the years, and I thought it was the perfect opportunity to use some of it. You can pretty much use whatever you want. I mean, I even thought about using dragon stone for this, certainly like Suryu stone, and anything would work for this. You just need to make sure that you have enough, because something like this is a small little thing. It took a lot of stone. We used an Awaza Optimax 250 as our pump to move our water around. You could use pretty much anything as long as you can fit it into that little cutout, that compartment in the back that protects the pump. And I'm sure you saw that I had to make a few modifications. We had to make that hole where the tubing comes out a little bit bigger. We ended up having to use some 5/8 inch corrugated plastic tubing for this, and I went with that instead of vinyl tubing just because I wasn't sure, you know, how we were going to snake that tubing around, and the corrugated stuff works really well for that. So I'll have links again for all of this stuff down in the description, just in case you're looking for some of the materials. Once we got the pump hooked up, we had to kind of figure out where we needed that tubing to go, where we wanted to have the main waterfall, I guess. So we definitely needed to start stacking rocks around in here. I didn't draw anything out. I was very much just doing this freehand, kind of figuring out how things would go, but you know, I ended up picking this kind of side here, or at least this area being the main waterfall area. And I'm sure you noticed we started to do kind of some weird stuff. We poked in some 1/4 inch tubing, and that way we could get some water into some other areas of this thing. I wasn't quite sure how the water was going to flow or where it needed to be relative to the plants, and we'll talk about the plants here in a second. So I wanted to give myself some options, and that's why we had, you know, those weird tubes poked in there at different points. That whole part of the setup was actually kind of tough for me. I had a pretty good mental block going. Like, I couldn't see how I wanted this thing to look, and I feel like a project like this, or just doing these AquaTerrariums, Paludariums, it's tough to visualize something and then get exactly what you want in return, just because you have to be doing so much weird stuff as you go along. For the most part, a lot of these rocks are just balancing on one another. We did end up using some of the pond and stone kind of gap filler to hold some of these areas in place, and mainly that was around where our big waterfall is. Without that stuff, I was getting a lot of weird runoff in areas that I didn't want, and it was kind of splashing and making a little bit too much noise, and so that helped solve that problem. If you spend any time on YouTube looking at how to set up these AquaTerrariums or paludariums, I'm sure you're going to come across Plantman Ansu. I'm not sure if that's how exactly you say that, my bad, but he has some crazy setups, very elaborate, and I didn't want to go quite that far. That's really, really advanced stuff. I wanted to try and make something that was a little more loose and a little easier to do. I should mention the light here before I forget. This is an AI Prime freshwater, and I think it just ends up working really well for this. The pendant style, I think, goes really well with these. So once the hardscape of this thing was done, we did several tests with water, to see how it would work out. Once I was comfortable, then we moved on. I kind of forgot to add substrate until the last minute. We ended up using the UN contra soil for this because that's primarily what I have lying around these days. At first I thought it would look better with black, or maybe even contrast it up with some gray or some kind of off-white substrate, but it's starting to grow on me now that we have more rocks here in the front. What really brought this whole project together was the plants. So let's talk about it. Okay, we have these ferns that I got from Lowe's, okay, and I took some tips from my buddy MD Fish Tanks regarding how to get these plants into position and what to do with them, and so we kind of just took the soil off and we wrapped them up, and we didn't do too much else. I think in his video, he put some aqua soil in there, put some fertilizer. I just opted to kind of leave it with a little bit of the soil around it, and we'll see what happens. I just placed the ferns kind of in a few areas where they kind of fit. Initially, it looks really bad because you don't have the moss covering some. That's the huge thing that makes this all come together, is that moss. So I just went out to a little forest behind my house, scraped some stuff off the sidewalk. There's tons of it all over the place, so that was super easy to find. And some of that moss has dirt and stuff on it, pine needles in there. We just laid it on, and we'll see what happens. The moss just totally covers up anything. We were able to, hide the blue filter floss, and some of it is in areas where it touches water, and other areas like back here, I think that's maybe not the best example. Like over here, there's not really any water, and this stuff is super hardy. Some of this was in a box in my basement for a few months, and it's still green and looking good. So the moss, I'm not really worried about if it has access to water or not, since it seems to be so hardy and fine if it doesn't have any water for a super long time. But the ferns, they will need something. I don't have them completely submerged at any point. I just tried to position them in areas where the rocks are wet at the very least. So again, trial and error, we'll see what happens. I think a huge part of what makes this come together is the sticks with moss in it that we placed in at the very end. These are just pieces that were, a grab from that little forested area, and it's not driftwood, it's not even cured wood. It is, probably gonna mold up a little bit, and it is gonna leach all kinds of weird stuff into the water, and we're just gonna go with it and see what happens. We're not gonna be putting fish in here right away. We need to make sure that this is something that's gonna be, around here long term. I hope it is. It looks really good now, but we just don't know what kind of level of decomposition we're gonna see, because a lot of this stuff is already kind of decomposing. I tried to keep as much of that stuff out of the water as possible, but there are some areas where it is getting water and it's, getting into the system. So we'll just have to see. I feel like I've said that a million times, but this is very much an experiment. This is the first time I've ever done this. I'm sure I've said that a million times, but I'm excited to see what happens, guys, and hopefully we can get to a point where we can add something to this, or at least we can feel comfortable enough to do that. The flow coming out of our 250 is pretty strong. When we poked holes in the tubing to run little areas with the 1/4 inch, that kind of slowed it down a little bit, but not by much. Nothing is set in stone. All we'd have to do is carefully rotate this thing a little bit and pull that pump out, swap it out for something else. A DC pump would be really cool. That way we could control the flow on the fly, which would be pretty sweet, but I don't know, we'll see what happens. For right now, I don't mind it, but if you take a listen, it is kind of loud, so we'll see if that bugs me or not. Maybe it won't. Maybe, it'll end up being a real therapeutic thing. And yes, there will be bugs that come out of this. I can already actually see some ants on this piece of wood, which is not great. It turns into fish food, right? Some of you guys might be wondering about filtration. With something like this, the rocks end up being our filter. Water comes up, runs down that rocky surface. Bacteria are going to start to colonize there, and that will effectively be our filter media, which is pretty cool. I really like that. And something that I think is pretty cool is that I have a feeling we're gonna have an opportunity to put some aquatic mosses in the real heavy stream area of our waterfall here. I think that would be really cool, and it's also gonna help to cover up some of that pond and stone filler that you can kind of see if you look really closely. Anyway guys, that's the AquaTerrarium, my first one. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you like today's video, and yeah, we'll just see what happens with this. I really don't know, but thanks for stopping by and watching the video, guys. We'll see you in the next one.